Hi and welcome back to my channel. I'm Simon and today I'm back with my November reading wrap up. So all the things that I read or what I read in November. I was going to combine November and some of December and I thought no, that's not fair on November or December. Plus I've been trying to get back into the swing of wrap ups this year because I had a blip with them over the last few years, but I want to be giving you a wrap up every month in 2024. Anyway, it's not 2024 yet, although it isn't far off because I've left this November wrap up until the middle of December. We're only 11 days away from Christmas, so blimey. But I haven't made the library very festive this year. It's very festive downstairs. That sounds a little bit like a euphemism. But it's very festive downstairs, but just not up here. So maybe that's something that I'll do next year. We'll see. But anyway, that's December. Let's go back to November. And I read some corking books in November, a couple of new favourites and some that I just really loved, which sounds like they should be favourites, but well, we'll come to that. So first up, a book that is quite difficult to describe and I would say is not a book for everyone, but once I was in it, this book was very much for me and it's a book that I absolutely love and heartily recommend, but like I said, it won't be for everyone. So the book in question is Blackouts by Justin Torres, and I read Justin Torres's debut We the Animals years ago when it came out and I thought it was really brilliant, a really slight dark gem of a novel. I think this is a bit more of a chunkster, but it's also a lot more, what's the word I want to use, experimental, which of course may make many of you just go, no, I don't want to read that right now. But honestly, it's worth it because this book is such a brilliant book in telling a tale of an unlikely friendship, telling you some of the darker parts of queer history that you might not have heard of, as well as some of the ones that you may well have heard of. And it does it in a really quite powerful, haunting, beguiling, tricksy way. It's about a man who is dying called Gaye, and he is staying at what he calls the palace, and he's joined there by a man whose name we never get, a much younger man who has come there to be with him during his final days. And as they are together, not only do they share their stories and sort of blackouts that they've had in their own past, but they also look at this document, which was a real document, written by a queer woman called Gaye, who is an anthropologist. I'm still not 100% sure what they do, but anyway. And throughout the text of this book is that text with some of it, you guessed it, I'm trying to find it, I just found the picture of the naked man, which is always a treat. Anyway, you have, and this is a real multimedia book. I'm just trying to find one now. Of course, at the moment that I want one, I can't find one. And I'm probably not going to edit this video because I am time poor this week. But yeah, you get some of the text, which has had parts of it blacked out. But when you read it, it makes its own statement, which I just think is so clever. And I think how Justin Torres had even the idea for this blows my mind. But the fact that he has created this fictional text that blends facts, so it's kind of, I guess, on the verge of faction, and also writes this really, well, it's an unflinching story of two gay men, one older, one younger, and their relationship, but also the relationships they've had with other people, the relationships with society and themselves, and all those things is just truly wow. I think this is just one of those books that's a real wow. Now, like I said, it won't be for everyone. And so even though I want to tell everyone to read it, I would say dip your toe in, pick it up somewhere, have a flick through, see how you feel about it. But I did think the way that it mixes the multimedia and it mixes that naked man again. And oh, now of course I'm finding loads of blacked out pages, but also it's even got some of the story of Gaye herself. So yeah, I just found it in some ways reminded me of, no, did it? It did and it didn't. This is the thing. It's got these glimmers of other books. So when I was reading it, I kept thinking of like The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, which looks at queerness. And I kept thinking of books that I've read about the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, but also this looks at some of the ways that queer people were literally looked at almost like lab rats. Like it's quite shocking to read. So yeah, it's shocking, it's haunting, it's powerful, it's amazing. I thought this was a wow book and would highly, highly, highly recommend it. I feel like I've not done it enough justice, but when I tried to do a video just about this, I made it sound way more complicated than I wanted it to. So I need to work out how to pitch this a little bit better. But if you read it and you love it, you'll really, really love it. So there we have that one. Then, interestingly, a book that I think really sang to Blackouts, and I almost made a video about how these two books spoke to each other. Another almost video, but the sort of videos that I'm thinking I would like to make more of next year. Well, I haven't even made it this year, but you know what I mean. The next book was one that I read for an event, and I really wanted to do the event because I was desperate to interview the 4 authors. What I didn't expect to get from this book was the utter celebration of life, the way it really encapsulates quite a few moments in history and what it's been like for people who have been ostracised and on the outside. It's also a real story of survival and survivors, and it's one that brought me so much laughter but also made me cry, and it's The Old Gays' Guide to the Good Life, and I had the pleasure of interviewing them for an online event for Fane, and they were absolutely wonderful. Sassy, snarky, just my kind of thing. And this book surprised me so much. It is a guide to the good life, looking at these 4 men's combined history and years of experience. And at no point is it preachy, it's just joyful, even when it's really hard to read. So for example, in one section of this book, it'll be all about like how they almost have these sort of characteristics, a bit like the Spice Girls, if you know what I mean. There's a quiet one, there's a extroverted one, etc. And at the same time, there will be these heartbreaking moments about the relationships they had or didn't have with their parents, some of the relationships that they've had that have broken down, as well as the loves that have really lasted, be they literally lasted years or just lasted within their hearts. There's also some truly devastating, unflinching writing about the 80s and how that was for these guys, some of whom lost like over 30% of their friendship group. Like, it is terrifying. And yet it's also about how these 4 guys who have survived that, how they live on behalf of the people, how they celebrate queer lives, how, you know, there was a really interesting discussion around this about how without the AIDS epidemic, maybe gay rights might not have moved in the way that they have, which I know isn't good enough for all and certainly isn't good enough around the world, but is so much better than it used to be. But then also there was this time where it almost didn't matter in these sort of halcyon days just before the AIDS epidemic. It's honestly incredible, but also just really funny, really frank about sex, really frank about just life. And I think this is a corking book, an unexpected gem. And like I said, these two really sort of sang to each other. Quite a surprising combo, but definitely one that I would go for. Maybe read this and then this. That's what I might suggest. So we have those two. Now, next up, more non-fiction. Like I said, Blackouts was fiction with that faction element, and this is non-fiction, and it was non-fiction November. And the next 2 books I read for an event that I chaired for Chester Literature Festival, and the first one was All the Wide Border by Mike Parker, Wales, England and the Places in Between. Now if you're thinking, ooh, I've heard you talk about Mike Parker before. I have, because Mike, who is now a friend of mine, wrote On the Red Hill, which is one of my favourite ever non-fiction memoirs. I just think it's just incredible. And if you haven't read it yet, shame on you, because I have been wanging on about this book, that's the technical term, for a very long time. I will link down below the vlog that I made while I was actually on the Red Hill, because this is in part about a place, and I have been to that place. I've taken Mum to that place. I've revisited often. Actually, I haven't been this year, shame on me, so I definitely need to make sure I go next spring. But yeah, it's just a wonder. Anyway, so I was very excited for All the Wide Border, and I really, really enjoyed this. I think in part it's a book that if you know the places in the book, because this takes place along the border between England and Wales, which is this kind of quite magical area, and I loved how Mike celebrates that. And one thing that I really want to kind of say at the start is I really want Mike to write a novel, because some of the writing in this, just like it was in here, is so beautiful, and you're so in it. The narrative, it's like you're walking with Mike in this book as he goes out and heads all the wide border. And what this book looks at is, in part, it is a pandemic book, because it looks at how England and Wales were right next to each other, and yet they handled the pandemic in very different ways. There were different laws, different rules, all sorts. But also it looks at how this place has sort of become partly a forgotten wilderness, but yet a really magical place if you've been and you just love it. And what a border means, how people are on either side of the border, what it's like for incomers into one side or vice versa. There's so much in here, as well as it just really celebrating kind of the everyday magic of the Welsh English countryside in many ways, but also the importance and power of walking. So there's just so much going on in here. Really, really brilliant. Very different from On the Red Hill, which is always super exciting. And yeah, I just really, really loved this. And I'll show you some of the maps and things that it's got in it. Again, as soon as I do this, of course, I can't find it. Whereas when there you go. So you can see sort of, actually this one is heading almost up to Chester, and then you've actually got this area, which is where my mother lives. So I know she's got a copy, and she's going to be reading it at some point, because she loves Mike almost as much as I do. But yeah, I just really, really enjoyed this, and the way Mike looks at the history of place, looks at the potential future and the complexities, and looks at the political with a big P and a little p. And yeah, it's just a fantastic, fantastic book. Now, with Mike was an author whose book I might not have, in fact, I'm not going to say I might not have read, I wouldn't have read if it wasn't for the fact that I was hosting this event quite last minute as well. And I was a little bit nervous this one, because I thought, okay, this isn't exactly my kind of bag, and I need to read it quite quickly. Well, I was hooked. It's High Caucasus by Tom. I'm not editing this, so apologies, Tom, because I nearly called you Tom Farpit. Tom Parfitt, A Mountain Quest in Russia's Haunted Hinterland. Now, I have to admit here that anytime I hear anything about Russia, part of me sort of just zones out because of my politics around that country and what it, well, in terms of its power, is doing, not only to people neighbouring wise, but also people within its own communities. And that's not something I'm going to talk about any further in here, because I do think it's a tricky one, isn't it? I'm a book channel here to talk about books, possibly to provide some of you all from escape from what's going on. I know lots of people have asked me to talk about what's going on, or at least comment on what's going on with the conflict between Israel and Gaza. And I have my opinions. I feel like if you've been here a long time, you will know what my politics are and what my opinions would be, and how horrific I think what is going on and why. And also the fact that a horrific terrorist organisation started this, and then it's just got out of control and is, well, it's just horrific. But I'm very aware of the fact that, yeah, like I said, in part, this is a safe space for people to come to, I don't know if entertained is the right word, but to come hear about books and escape. And that's sometimes what you want from a book. You don't always want to be confronted by the real world. And we need to educate ourselves. But I think that's it's often an internal thing. And I think that's a very personal thing. And I don't think it's a performative thing. So just putting that out there. Anyway, going back to this. So that's why I've not always been like, oh, I don't want to read about Russia. And I have to say, I found the beginning part of the book where Tom was talking about his time in Russia quite hard, because it one sort of marred against my opinion that I have placed on Russia and my prejudices, because I find their power so abhorrent. But at the same time gave me a real insight into that from someone who was living there every day, and also was seeing horrific things. One particular horrific incident that leads him to want to stop being a journalist reporting on Russia for a while and go and do this walk along the Caucasus and find out much more about the border of this land with other places, other people. And what you get here is often quite hard to read because Tom meets some real characters. Also, it made me question certain things and certain prejudices that I had put in place across a whole nation and not thought that there are people within the nation who don't agree with what's going on. Like, I mean, for example, if you looked at me as a British person now, you would think that I want every single refugee to go and live in Rwanda where they're completely unsafe, which is not the case at all. I think that is, again, abhorrent and horrific. But this book made me think about that and how people might perceive me because of the country I'm from and what the headlines are around that country right now. And that, I think, is a really powerful thing for books to do, as well as this kind of having a real adventure feel to it too, which actually, I should say, so did this. This was like an adventure on the Welsh and British border, which you wouldn't think is that adventurous, but it is. Whereas I guess with further climbs, you feel like it is just an adventure because you don't know it. So this opened my mind to so much, and following Tom's experience was fascinating. And I think and it's something I asked him about because he wrote this sort of quite a few years after he went on the walk, going back to all of the documentation because he needed that space from it. And for me, it was like he was holding my hand, taking me through the history of this place, the haunting of this place, but also holding his own hand and taking himself back there. And I thought that was quite a magical thing. So yeah, this was great. Really, really, really good. And quite unlike anything I've read before. And like I said, it isn't a book that I would have picked up necessarily. Well, no, I wouldn't have picked it up. And I'm really pleased I did because it challenged my prejudices, opened my eyes a bit, but also made me reflect on how other people may see me or British people because of where we are and what the politics is being spouted about from there. So yeah, that was quite the thing. Then on to something completely different. Let's head to a lighter note, but no less a brilliant read for it having a rompy nature to its heart, because I think this book is fab and I cannot wait to see what the author writes next. Again, this was for an event that I did this time at West Kirby Books, where I was talking to Lucy Barker about The Other Side of Mrs. Wood. This book has reminded me how much I bloody love a Victorian romp, and how when you've got a book that is, and I'm going to use this word because I love this word, bustling with characters that are fantastic, fully formed, all walks of life, lovely, not so lovely, some particularly devious, some tricksy, in a multitude of ways. Yeah, this is just a real treat. It's about a woman called Mrs. Wood, who is one of the most celebrated mediums in Victorian society, and she throws these huge seances which have got all sorts of things going on, and she speaks to these spirits, or does she? You have to read to find out. And she takes in, well, she's worried that maybe she's reached her pinnacle and there are other names coming up, and she's sort of, you know, the whole of society wants a fully formed spectre to appear, and Mrs. Wood has done some quite spectacular things, but a spectre she has not created. And so people are starting to look at other mediums. However, there's this younger woman who seems to have a gift, who's been following her a little bit, and who she takes in and trains. And I won't say any more, but it gets tricksy. What I loved about this book was not just the tricksy nature of it and the fact it was such a romp, and it really was the perfect book for November, and actually I would say winter. This is a really good winter book because sometimes you're in the coziness of Mrs. Wood's house, but sometimes it's quite cold and unsettling, and I like the drifting between the two of that at this time of year. Sometimes I leave the radiators off just for a thrill. I think it is the perfect read because you will get completely and utterly engrossed in it, and you will also, well, it's a really interesting book about women at the time period that this book was set, which I think is the 1870s. I was going to say 1880s, so it's a decade out, but not far off. And it's about women and how they can totally have to be there for each other. Friendship is a really big part of this. It's also about how when women go against other women, it can be the most heartbreaking and soul-destroying thing. It looks at whether the spirit world may or may not exist and why people would go to see people who might be able to put them in touch with their family or friends from the other side. And it's also a book, like I said, about the sort of societal expectations upon women, put upon women at this time period, which I loved, yet it didn't bash you over the head with it. The characters are fantastic. It's got I loved Mrs. Wood. I loved the young, why have I forgotten the name of the young woman who comes into it? Oh my lord, and now I can't find it here either. Emmy, that's it. I loved Mrs. Wood's best friend. I loved the housekeeper. I just loved all the women in it, and this book is very much a book about the power and perils of womanhood at that time, but like I said, just done as a real romp. So can't wait to see what Lucy Barker, not Mrs. Wood, Lucy Barker writes next. This was a corker. And then I read The Orange by Wendy Cope, which is a collection of some of her previous published poems, including The Orange, which I hadn't realised but has gone bonkers on TikTok, and people are making all sorts of videos to it. I'd forgotten how great that poem was. I love Wendy Cope. I've been a big fan of her for a long time. My mum has always had her collections as far as I can remember, and so going to this and being reminded and going back, I guess, by proxy to some of her older poems just reminded me what an absolute genius she is as a poet. And yeah, I think she's fab. It's made me want to head to all the collections of hers that I've got that I haven't read. Plus, it's got some of my very, very favourite poems in. Let me see if I can find one. I quite like Two Cures for Love. 1, don't see him, don't phone or write a letter. 2, the easy way, get to know him better. So some of the poems are really short, really brilliant, really powerful, and she rhymes, which is the sort of poems that I like. Then we have Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, this year's Booker Prize winner. I read this just before the Booker Prize was announced. I was currently reading Jonathan Scoffrey's book as it was announced. I'm really loving that, but I didn't actually finish that until this month, so I'll talk about it then. But that's not the book that I've got in my hand, for this is the winner, Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. I thought this was pretty blinking brilliant. Quite a few people have told me I would struggle with it maybe because there's basically not any sentences, but I didn't really know, well, not any breaks, sorry, there's lots of sentences but not any breaks. I didn't really notice that at all, because once I was in this book, I was totally in and swept up in it. This is a book about a woman there's a knock one day at the door. She's in Ireland and the guard have come to basically talk to her about her husband and something that he might have been doing. Eventually he gets taken away. She's left on her own with her children to look after. And we watch as not only does her family unravel, but the whole of society pretty much unravels, and it is devastating. It's also terrifying. This book really unsettled me because of the pace at which things can change and how easily you can go from having control to no control to being completely controlled, and it can happen really, really surreptitiously and discreetly. And the fact that this is so based within a family dynamic and you're following, I don't like to use the term, but like an everyday woman as she tries to survive. Well, at first with all the shock of everything goes on, but then also tries to survive it. And then as we see, there are complexities that come in terms of one of her children, her father, and obviously the fact that her husband has gone. It also looks at how people ostracize people and look for ways to do so when the people that you think you wouldn't have fault with suddenly find they are very different from you and don't want to be around that difference. That also is looked at. I mean, there's so much in this book, and I think it is beautifully written. Like, there are some sentences here that are just absolutely stunning. And yeah, I just thought it was a really, really, really incredible read, and I was really thrilled when it won. I will say it's massive font actually for the size of the book, but and the price of the book, but that's just another thing. Don't get me started on that, because then I'll bring up The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell and my absolute rage at how much that book was. No fault of Mag's, I'm sure, but like how much that book was for technically the amount of words you got in it. But yeah, I just thought I just followed Eilish and her family, and yeah, was pretty yeah, that was the general feeling I had in the book, apart from quite a lot of anxiety every so often, just this real so yeah, there we go. Penultimately, another absolute favourite read of the year, and one I'm going to be wanging on about non-stop. It's more non-fiction. I realised that as it got to the end of the month, I had read 3 books of non-fiction, and all 3 were written by men. I was like, I need to sort that out. And so I picked up The Golden Mole and Other Vanishing Treasure, with illustrations by Talia Baldwin, by Katherine Rundell. And I think I'm going to be having a Katherine Rundell binge soon. I've read one of her books before. I had read one of her books before this. I've now read 2. And that was The Explorer, which won the Costa Book Awards quite a few years ago. Thought that was really good. A proper middle grade adventure that also any parent reading it to their children, or just wanting to read it because you like middle grade. You could be middle-aged and enjoy middle grade. There's nothing wrong with that either. But anyone who just enjoys middle grade books would love it. This is just the most... I think Katherine Rundell does something quite magical with this book. So The Golden Mole is all about various different animals that are in danger of becoming extinct, or certainly very endangered. And some of the animals within here, you would be really surprised to see included. There are a few animals where I thought, no, surely they aren't endangered. How can that be? I've seen some recently, like hedgehogs. But there are quite a lot in here that I was actually quite shocked that could not be around in a few decades' time. Now, that makes the book sound really depressing. And in some ways it is, rightly so, because we need to know, but also at the same time, in celebrating the wonders of all the fantastic creatures in this book, there is a hope that we can change things, that we can turn things around for them. And in fact, the golden mole, which people did actually think was pretty much extinct, has suddenly been seen again, so that's kind of spooky. It's also got the most incredible I'll try and find the narwhal if I can, but I've just found the seal. I want to find the narwhal. Where's the narwhal? Talk amongst yourselves while that Simon, who has not prepared properly, struggles to find. Well, actually no, here's a giraffe. One thing that this book did that I absolutely loved, linking to the giraffe, is give me so many fascinating facts. I have been literally telling, okay, maybe sometimes the same ones over and over again, but I've been telling loads of people loads of facts that I learned throughout this book, like the fact that I didn't know that a very high percentage, I think it's in the 90s, I don't want to get this wrong though, and be sued by the Giraffe Society, but I think it's in the 90% of giraffe well, not even reproduction, because that defies the point. Giraffe sex is homosexual sex. And when I was telling Kate of Harrison Harris the Bookshop this at the weekend, her point was, I wonder why they're going extinct. And yes, she has a point. But so that was one that I found really fascinating. I also didn't know that swifts can sometimes leave the nest and never touch the ground again throughout their whole life. Mind-blowing. Also, there was a fact around the green shark, which can live between 300 and 500 years, and its offspring. That was terrifying. I shall say no more, because you need to read this. But honestly, it's just so wonderful. And I mean, like the tuna. You know what I mean? I'm always on about my tuna sandwiches. It's really made me think about that. So, yeah, I just thought this was absolutely fantastic. And I loved the fact that there was lots of historical references to certain creatures. Like I was saying, the narwhal is in here, and that was what many believed to be a unicorn or where the myth of the unicorn came from. You also look at some of the mad bonkers beliefs that people have had in history about certain animals and what powers eating them might have, and how when you hear that now it sounds utterly daft, but at the time people totally believed it. And just, yeah, it's one of those books that both makes you confront an unsettling truth, but you see the hope and possibility of being able to turn everything around, and just the celebration of how incredible nature is and how incredible these vanishing treasures are. So yeah, absolutely amazing. And then last but not least is a book that I read for my Savage Reads prompt for November. The prompt jar, I need to get a wriggle on and put some more in, because me and Mum are going to be picking the prompts on New Year's Eve, I think, for a video early in January. And for those of you who don't know, Savage prompts are 13 prompts that my mum and I pulled from a trifle dish last year. I've upgraded to an actual jar this year, or for next year. And they were suggested by lots of you, lovely lot. And each month we pick a book of our shelves that links to a prompt. There's one bonus prompt, which I started in November, but I haven't finished yet. So I'll mention that in my December wrap up. For the bonus prompt, did I say that? Anyway, but the prompt that one of you had very kindly sent in and was plucked from the trifle dish for November was to read a book that had been on your shelves for a long time. Now, I mildly cheated, because I will say I love doing the prompts overall, and if you've got any more that you would like putting in this jar, leave them in the comments down below. You're more than welcome. I'll be doing a few more call outs before the year is through. But I love it because it makes me shop my shelves in a different way, which is brilliant. But also sometimes I'm time poor. I think of a book and I'm like, oh, I really want to head to that, but it'll be really massive, or I go into it because I've waited until the end of the month or whatever. And that was the case with November. I'd left it too long. I started freaking out about it. And then I picked a book that has been, well, this is going to sound odd. It hasn't been on my shelves for a long time, and yet it has been on the shelves for the entirety of my life, because it was The Story of Persephone by Penelope Palmer and Graham McCullum. And I have talked about this book on the channel quite a few times, because I've been desperately trying to find my own copy, because this is a book, it isn't her copy, mine's actually more pristine, but this is a book that my mum has had on her shelves for years, longer than my lifetime, and she used to read to me when I was a kid. And it's the story of Persephone and Demeter, or the myth of Persephone and Demeter. The illustrations in here are incredible. If you want to see more of them, you can head to a video that I did with my little sister Miriam about our favourite classical, or her favourite classical myth retellings, of which I'd read quite a few. What was lovely to hear, by the way, on some of the comments, was that you weren't going to watch it because you didn't think you were interested in classical myths, and how you watched it, got engrossed, and now starting to read some of Miriam's recommendations. That is lovely. And if you haven't watched it, please go and do so, because my sister's lovely, and I feel like that video deserves more views than it's got. There, I've said it. So anyway, yeah, I read this because I ordered it. I found it on eBay for £3 whole. I've seen it listed sometimes for 150. Absolute bargain, in amazing condition. And as soon as it arrived, it happened to be, I think, yeah, it was just before the end of November. I picked it up on the last day of November and just went down this nostalgic, I mean, it is quite gothic and quite sinister in some ways, this picture book. Went down this nostalgic wonder, and yeah, there we go. So that was the last book that I read of the month, but actually I think one of the best finds book-wise of the entire year, because this reminds me so much of Mum reading it to me as a kid, and then being able to read it back to her as I got older, and it always just having been in the house. And yeah, I don't know. So it has been a book that has been on my shelves, or the shelves around me, for the longest time, and now I'm thrilled that actually it's also one of the newest books on my shelves, but means the absolute world to me. And thank you to lots and lots of you who, whenever you've seen a Persephone based picture book, have gone, oh Simon, is that the one? And I've been like, oh no, sorry, it's not. I mean, sorry, there's another gothic one, but stop it. You can go to that video that I will link down below to see more pictures from here. But this was just a treat. And whilst I'm not a big rereader, because I've reread favourite books before and then had a little bit of disappointment, let's not lie, there's something about this and the images and the, I guess, how short it is, that never disappoints. It's always just like I love this book so much. So there we go. So it was a much better reading month, November. December, I've read one of the best books of the year so far, and also probably one of my least favourite books of the year so far. And yeah, I've not been reading very much actually, but I will try and do a December wrap up before the year is through. I am planning at the end of the year of doing a video where I give every book I read in 2023 a one sentence review. Let's see how I go about that. That's going to be quite the one to edit. I'm going to try and record that between well, I need to record that by the end of the year. Anyway, moving on. You don't need to know the admin and the ins and outs. But actually on admin, if you're thinking, Simon, you said it isn't very festive, like what's going on? I am actually doing Vlogmas vlogs over on Patreon, which I'll link down below. Thank you to a few of you, and you'll see this in my December book haul, because I'm doing one of those, even though I said I wasn't, because enough books have arrived for me to feel that I need to. I worked in Harris & Harris bookshop at the weekend, and funnily enough, I bought almost as many books as I sold. In fact, no, that's not true. I bought about 6 books. I sold a lot of books. It was a lot of fun. And I'll be back with a video with Kate from Harris & Harris in due course. But yeah, I'm going to do a haul. But what I wanted to say before I got sidetracked by myself was thank you to those of you who have very kindly sent me some books off my wish list, which is also linked down below, along with my Instagram, my X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, etc, etc, etc. And yeah, if you want to get some Vlogmas vlogs, Patreon's your place. You get lots of other extra content too, but I will also be carrying on making videos here. I did say 2 a week. I was so shattered after the weekend, that hasn't happened. But yeah, next year the plan is definitely 2 a week. But I've wanged on for quite long enough. I hope you're all doing super duper well. Thank you as always for spending time with me. Let's keep the conversation going on in the comments down below. Let me know what you thought of the books that I read in November, and let me know what you read in November that you really, really loved, and even what you didn't. And I will speak to you all in another video very, very soon. Bye.